And so before we start, we're going to ask a poll question, and I'm going to ask Diane to put the poll question up. And the question is, are you currently using Empowering Writers, either resources or materials? It's always helpful for us to get an idea of who our audience is, how many of you are familiar with Empowering Writers and our approach, and how many of you are new to it. Okay, well, welcome. We have about over 60% of you who are currently using Empowering Writers. We have about 20% that are not using it, and another group that is not using it yet. So great. Thanks for coming, everybody. And let's start by introducing ourselves and our panel. My name is Dea Ore. I am one of the founders of Empowering Writers, educator and CEO, and delighted to have you here. And joining me today, we have Diane Lazar.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Jennifer Seaton.
Hello. So glad to have you this afternoon.
And Kathy Howell.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
So for those of you who have been trained by us, these might be familiar faces that you know well. And so feel free to chat in any questions as we go. And the one thing we want to ask you before we actually dive in, because as you know, with Empowering Writers, we're always going to be talking about writing. And if you would just chat in the box what some of your writing challenges are. Could be anything. Just chat right into the box for this one. Time. Writing incomplete sentences. Virtual challenges. Reluctant writers.
Whole new challenge.
Students wanting to be done. Oh, I know that. Adding details using descriptive organization, consistency. Getting them to write long pieces, lack of structure.
Oh, Felicia, getting the whole team on the EW journey.
Not knowing how to begin the writing process. Reluctant to accept feedback. Oh,
plot holes. That's a good one.
Generating ideas. That's oftentimes the biggest roadblock.
Reluctant writers helping students at high level. Great. Good. Thank you for sharing some of those. And we're going to start out today by really introducing you to some of our challenges. And a lot of the challenges that you see here on the screen are the challenges that really help to shape Empowering Writers. So the first thing that we always like to say, especially when we gather a group of teachers and we're going to be talking about writing instruction, there is a fair number of us who feel really uncomfortable with teaching writing. And the one thing that I'd like to always add is that we feel that way because most of us never had to take a course on how to teach writing. So when we're talking, we could be talking to hundreds of teachers. And when we ask them, did you have to take a course on how to teach writing to get certified to teach? The majority of us say no. So here it is, something that is one of the more complex tasks that we do is, as you will see when we dive into this, it is the root of a lot of literacy, and we don't know how to teach it effectively because we haven't been shown how. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We also want to talk about the language of authors. How do we look at writing through the lens of an author? And how do we as teachers come up with a common language and assured experiences for our students? Because most of us don't have a set writing curriculum. Therefore, we teach many of the ways in which we have been taught, and our language is unique to our own instruction. So how can we come together with some common language and some assured experiences? And what does that look like in terms of how it impacts our student writers? Another thing we hear a lot about is reading programs. A lot of our reading programs come with an embedded writing program. And so many times we feel as though we are provided with what we need to do with writing, when in reality, a lot of those are writing assignments. It's not the how do I teach the writing, it's here's a writing assignment to do in conjunction with the reading that you just did. And so we use that as our jumping off point for instruction. And what we really find is we don't have a lot to offer. There's not a lot of the granular instruction that's necessary. Another issue that we all had was really thinking of writing as a block of time. Where am I going to fit writing? How do I have a writing block in which I can spend time teaching writing? And I know that's a huge issue for all of us, because here's the reality. Time is the constraint we all have. And I'm going to say to you that Having done this all these years and in my own classroom when Empowering Writers was developed, we didn't have a time. We had no time for writing. Writing was built into the reading block. And so you had to fit it in. So you know what that's like. You have to fit in something. And if you don't particularly feel comfortable with it, how much time do we spend actually fitting it in? And then how much of that time is instructional, where I can actually teach my students new discrete skills for writing? And how much of that time is my management time? How do I manage a classroom? And then go one step further. And in a lot of states that we work in, there's a whole group of us that test on a particular genre in writing. So I could be teaching a certain grade level and focusing on narrative writing. My colleagues could be teaching another grade level and focusing on expository writing. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that in my classroom, if my focus for assessment was narrative, I focused my time on narrative. And as soon as those kids got up into the grade levels where the focus was expository, narrative was sort of left by the wayside. And now the focus became expository or informational writing. So that really drove a lot of the decisions we made in terms of how we teach. And here is the funny thing about that. In our classrooms, across all content areas, we're experiencing all genres. We're looking at narrative, we're looking at informational, we're looking at opinion, we're looking at argument. And yet we're focusing the writing instruction on one genre specifically. So we needed to really look at how do we broaden that scope? And I'm going to be the first one to say, I came from a state where we focused on a particular genre. And at the time when the change was made to go to multiple genres at every grade level, Empowering Writers was in full bloom at the time. And I thought, wow, this is going to be really hard for teachers to be able to really address this thoroughly. What I learned was, and what I really started to see was, it really helped our reading instruction to dive into those genres throughout the year. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we dive in to what we're going to address today. So I want you to think about this for a minute. What if every single time we read or we write, we recognize that writing-reading connection? First through the genre. What kind of genre is it? Is it narrative? Is it informational? Is it opinion? And then through the organization and author's purpose. So if I know I'm reading a narrative piece, there's a predictable organization that takes place, and the author wrote it for a particular purpose. What if every single time we were reading or writing, we had a proactive interaction with text? That means that every reading experience becomes a pre-writing experience, and every writing experience becomes a pre-reading experience. What if we can maximize our instructional time? We're all going to talk about that instructional time. How do we use it well? By recognizing the connection in all text through all content areas, meaning that as we start to teach students about what good writing looks like, we're going to revisit that every single time we look at text. What if we set up our instruction that way? And that's really what our Foundations of Literacy is all about. And so what I want you to take a moment and think about, take a look at what we have here on the slide, our Venn diagram. And I want you to think about this in terms of all of the text we have in front of our students. And really what we want to do here is, for those of you who are familiar with Empowering Writers, and I know many of you are, you know that we spend the first good 5 or 6 weeks of school analyzing and annotating text. We spend a lot of time looking at text, author's purpose, how is it, why did the author write it? How is it organized? What's the graphic organizer? How can I summarize that? And all of us as Empowering Writers trainers always get the question, when are we going to write? Or why do we have to spend so much time annotating and analyzing? When are we going to get to actually putting our pencil to paper? And what we really want to show you is why this is so important. Why is it so important that we look at writing through the lens of authors first, before we jump into putting our pencil to the paper? And so that's what the Foundations of Literacy is about. And here's what I want you to think about as we walk through our presentation today. Always we look at writing through, first of all, why did the author write it? What's the genre? How is it organized? What graphic organizer did the author use to develop this piece? How do they summarize it? How can I look at the content of this piece and summarize it? All of that is revealed through the process of annotation and analysis. You'll notice in the Venn diagram that we have on one side informational and on the other side we have narrative. Those are the two genres where our young authors spend most of their time. In the outside of that Venn diagram, underneath informational narrative, those are the discrete skills that students take to the task of writing. We're going to learn them on two levels. One is to generate them. We want them to be able to write about them, to be able to use those skills to improve their piece. But on the other level is awareness. So all of us that are here today, whether you're an administrator, a classroom teacher, a specialist, what I want you to think about, our job is to really have students be able to look at literature this way, so that every single time they're in front of literature, they're going to make some decisions right away. What am I reading? Why am I reading it? Why did the author write this? How can I use the information that I know as reading with author's eyes to be able to bring this to the simplest terms, which would be our summarizing frameworks? On the far right and the far left of the slide, you see our organizational frameworks. For those of you who are familiar with empowering writers, you know this. We all agree on one framework for informational writing and one framework for narrative writing. It's modified in K&1, but it takes them all the way through the grade levels. And it works in terms of demonstrating the organization of those particular genres. So as we move forward and look at how we utilize this and why this is so important for our students to understand how writing is put together in order to be able to reproduce it and respond to it, I want you to keep in mind this particular graphic organizer, and we're going to circle back to it in a minute. So with this knowledge, if our students came to the task of this, they would have a clear understanding of author's purpose and how and why they're going to interact with that text. If they're reading for information, they know why they're reading this informative piece. They're going to be able to read more strategically based on that. They're going to understand the organization and the skills that go into it. They'll be able to summarize content and find information effectively by skimming and scanning. And what's going to happen is as we start to teach those foundational salient skills that go into informational writing or narrative writing, they're going to be able to move through these stages incrementally from awareness. I understand what type of writing it is and elements that exist within it, to generative. I know how to apply those elements and create these pieces, to being able to respond to text by knowing what those elements are, how it was created, and how to use that information to gather evidence and respond. So all of that understanding is going to be built in what we consider our literacy launch. That's going to happen in the first few weeks of school, where we spend all of our time with our students really looking at text through the lens of annotation and analysis. For all of you that are familiar with empowering writers, you know this. There are no conversations to be had without common language or shared experiences. And the common language part of that is critical. In order for me to be able to talk to my students about writing and about how authors work, we need to have a common language that we all can speak. And when I talk about common language, I'm absolutely talking about within my classroom, but I'm also talking about across and between grade levels. When we first developed Empowering Writers, which was born out of our classrooms, the first thing that we recognized is that all of us were speaking our own language and we were doing our own thing. So there was not common language and there was not a shared experiences. In order for us to move the needle in any way, we've got to agree on language and we have to agree on how we scaffold instruction. All of that is built and supported through our methodology. This methodology is the methodology we use for all instruction, which is first, introduce and define the skill through the use of published examples. Always looking at literature. What do authors do? Step 2 is model. Modeling out loud the thought process of the author, what questions come to mind, to be able to answer, to develop the text. What am I wondering? How do I answer those questions? How can I build language? Modeling is a place where language is built all the time. Many of us are in classrooms where our students don't have that language. It happens here. It happens with us as teachers, talking out loud as the authors, building that language, sharing those productive questions, asking those questions out loud. That's the critical part of modeling. And I'm going to say this, it's also the part that most of us who don't view us as ourselves as authors or writers or even comfortable with the writing process like to skip through because it's uncomfortable. And that's the part that Empowering Writers really, really focuses on. How do you do it? How do you do it well? How do we break down this process for you so that you can be successful? So we're going to provide you with the tools that inform your instruction, that show you how to break this down to manageable parts, and then how eventually over time, you're going to teach these to your students and they're going to be able to apply those skills. And it's all going to be couched in that common language. From modeling, we move to guided practice. I did it, now you try it. You'll notice that we also have included some peer conferencing, and the peer conferencing that's present in there is all about how do our students talk to each other. Again, I'm going to emphasize this. Our students can't have meaningful conversations about writing or productive conversations about writing without common language. So the common language that we're building in our classrooms is going to show up in the peer conferencing over time. As we teach skills, we're going to see this application take place. And always what we like to say is that oral precedes written. So if our kids can't say it, they can't write it. So we spend a fair amount of time building that instruction. So for today, we're going to start off with what we call our literacy launch, which is really based on our very first skills that we teach, which is all about organization and genre. And so these lessons are filtered through that methodology. And I'm going to ask Dida to take it from there.
Thanks, Dea. So we talk a lot at Empowering Writers about reading with author's eyes. And what we're really talking about is this. How does the annotation and analysis process help us to break text down? How are we as readers able to understand the organizational structure of a piece of writing, the genre, and the author's purpose? It's really through reading with author's eyes. And the very first starting point is really with us, the teacher. And so we are going to kind of hone in on the things that we need as teachers in order to do this effectively in our own classrooms. So today's focus is really informational writing, and certainly any of this can be applied to argument writing, opinion writing, narrative writing, very same kinds of strategies and structures. So let's take a look at how informational writing is structured. You saw earlier in our literacy launch that it's structured through the introduction, the pillar, right? Introduction, the main ideas, supporting details, and that conclusion paragraph. So when we're looking at informational writing, we're looking for that kind of structure. So at Empowering Writers, what do? Well, we start very clearly by building a foundation for this. We want students to clearly see the informational structure so that when they read, they're able to pick it out. If you look at the piece of writing that we have already annotated and analyzed called Natural Wonders, you'll see that there's the pillar shape really becomes uncovered. You see there's an introduction paragraph, a conclusion paragraph, several body paragraphs with main ideas. And that's what we want kids to see. So this is the foundation for all text experiences. The ability to look at a text, uncover the structure, and know immediately that the genre that I'm reading is informational in purpose. That's important. Imagine that happens every time that you put kids in front of text, that they're able to see that structure come alive. So how do we run this kind of annotation? Well, we use a very specific procedure. It's our annotation and analysis process. And to be honest, when I would tell my students to annotate and analyze text, I don't know about you, but this is what I got. I wound up with kids either underlining or highlighting pretty much everything in the text. And or if I would give them sticky notes, what did they do? They put sticky notes everywhere. And they really had no good process. They didn't know what they were looking at. And because they didn't know what they were looking at, they didn't know how to annotate or analyze. So we give them a process for that. And so during that time frame, when you're going to be using our Empowering Writers texts, we want you to build in that foundation for them. We want them to be able to identify the genre and the author's purpose immediately. So how do we do it? Well, we project the text. We give kids a clean copy of the text, and together we work through that piece. I never ever send kids off on their own to do it. This is not basically a, here you go figure this out, but it's about the conversations now that I'm going to have with students. I want them to really start to see this text come alive. So we identify the title, the topic, we number our paragraphs. We offset the pillar by circling the intro and labeling it, and then boxing the conclusion. Finally, we move into the body of the piece. We want kids to see main idea sentences that are clearly stated. And because they're clearly stated, we can be able to easily figure out what the entire paragraph is about. We put our blurb in the margin. So because this is such great foundational work, my kids are able to do this very clearly right along with me. Remember, we'll go back to our methodology, and this is that modeling process. I'm in charge of this. It's very, very guided. So as we're guiding the process, what's happening? Kids are starting to internalize it. We don't change the process. We continually use that very same process, building in that foundation. So these are some great pure examples. And of course, what we keep talking about, and we've said it to you already a couple of times, is we want you to be able to take this very same process to the texts that you're using across your content areas. So I just want to show you a couple of ways that we want you to begin to think through this. In order to do that, you have to have a foundational understanding of all the skills of this genre of writing. And again, our focus today is on informational, but this very same kind of work can be done within any genre that you're working towards. But as the teacher, what do I need? I need to understand all the skills of the pillar. And that's really what our literacy launch does for you. Again, what do I need? I have to be able to look at the pillar and begin to understand the structure of a text that I want to present to students. So I start with my Empowering Writers texts, and now I want to start to think about the text that I use across my content. So we've provided you with an informational text analysis form. You should have received that in the link right along with your reminder this morning to come and join us with your Zoom link. And we've given that to you so that you can start to think about the text that you use naturally. And it should be used to assess your instructional opportunities across your curriculum content areas. And one of the things that you might want to do is highlight, underline, or place sticky notes someplace in your text that you're going to be using so that you can then annotate it and analyze it later on with your students. The other thing that's really important is sort of that first line. When we provide this analysis form, what we're saying to you is this: if you want to use this text, what is it good for? What instructional moments, teachable moments, can you see that this text provides? Because another thing that I know about myself anyway is that I would use a text and I loved it for a certain purpose, like maybe it had a great introduction, or perhaps the details were really well developed. And then, of course, I'd bring that text back up the following year because it was part of maybe a reading series we were working with, and I forgot what I liked about it. Well, this analysis form helps you to keep track of the text that you use year after year and the kinds of teachable moments that you can find within the text. Now, to be honest with you, some texts, I'm not going to find every single one of these things in a pure way, but there is definitely value in all of the text that I use. And I want to start to see that. So because I know the skills, because I understand that pillar structure, I'm going to be able to get everything out of the text that I provide for my students. And a lot of you said time was a challenge for you. You're going to be able to maximize your time. Here's what I mean by that. We're going to look at maybe some text in maybe your science content, right? You're going to be studying machines. You're looking at text because you're studying machines. Guess what? Why can't you have the genre conversation based upon that text? How about if you've taught the supporting details, what does it look like? Why is it important? Let's find those in this particular text. That's why this analysis form is going to be so helpful for you. It's going to maximize your time across your content area because you'll always have writing. You'll be reading with author's eyes, and you'll be able to use the work that you see here as your text evidence so often. So I want to bring this sort of to life with you. Let's take a look at sort of a couple of articles that we have found. And these are just articles from a variety of sources. You may use an online source yourself. This one comes from Common Lit. It's called The Fastest Woman in the World. And it's really all about Wilma Rudolph. It's her life. And what I love about this particular text is, at a glance, what do you see? I see headings. If I went back to my text analysis form, this particular text would be a great teaching tool for teaching students how to locate main ideas. The text does it immediately right there for me. And if I read through those main ideas, everything embedded within that little section definitely relates right back to the main idea. The other thing I love about this text is that it has a tremendous introduction paragraph. It really uses a great lead, and then the topic sentence is a little general, but you know exactly what's coming in that piece. So if I'm going to use this kind of a source text, I want to make sure that I know what's embedded here, what's in here, and what's useful to me and my students. And then you see there's another text that we've pulled up. This one's from Muse magazine. The name of this one is Scream Machine. So imagine that you are studying in science, you're studying machines. Well, I just want to read this introduction paragraph to you because this is so valuable. It's a really tremendous asset. And I would use this magazine article over and over again when I'm teaching leads. Listen to this one. Imagine being hauled up hundreds of feet in the air, flung down toward the ground at speeds nearing 100 miles per hour, yanked upwards so hard you feel you're being crushed, then flipped upside down and swung side to side until you're just about to lose your lunch. Doesn't that sound like fun? What a great descriptive segment with a little question. And then the article goes on. And again, embedded within this article, you're not going to see those kinds of headings. So it's definitely a step above that Common Lit passage where my kids can very easily see the headings. Now in the Scream Machine, what do we have to do? Well, we have to uncover the headings. We have to see what, or the main ideas rather. We have to see what the author intended. And oftentimes in a high-level text, like this particular Scream Machine article, the main ideas are embedded or inferred in some way. All right.
Di, before you move on, can I just jump in here for 1 second?
Yeah, please do.
Because you brought to mind when you're going through that article that we oftentimes don't realize the power of that instruction of having students be able to look at articles in this way. And I always like to refer back to what I would consider my own personal aha moment, which was when my own son was in 7th grade and struggling with writing assignments that were taking place in content areas. And a lot of times what had happened is they'd be given at the beginning of the week articles to read. And then at the end of the week, they had to respond to that article in some way. And so my son at the time was a very avid reader. And so when he kept coming home with basically tanking all these assignments that were given to him, I started to wonder why this was so challenging for him. So I had gone in to talk to his teachers, both science and social studies, and his team, and to talk about what was happening really with Jack. How come he wasn't getting this? And we had a whole little roundtable of discussion and talking about what Jack needs to be working on. And one of his teachers said at one point, you know what Jack's problem is Jack's problem is he's not a very good reader. And what was really interesting about that, where I know whenever I tell that story, teachers are like, oh, and I'm like, well, you know what? It was such an aha for me, because the one thing I knew for sure about Jack was that he was an excellent reader. But I also knew that Jack was not a good writer. And I knew he wasn't a good writer, and I knew he didn't like to write. And because of that fact, that was an aha for me, because he was unable to read strategically, to respond to text. It was so much work for him because he didn't understand the organization. So every single time he got to the end of the text and they asked a question about content, he would go back to the beginning and start reading all over again. And so for all of us as classroom teachers, when we watch our students interact with text and have those moments where you ask a question and you see where they go with their eyes, all of our students said they go back to the beginning for a question that's about the body of the piece. It's revealing to us in what do they understand about organization? What do they understand about the ways in which text is put together? So all of this that Diane is talking to us about in this movement from the foundational work we do with annotation analysis and our movement into content area text is really important for our kids to be able to read strategically. And this is how, one, we support it, we help it, and we recognize where those weaknesses are.
Thanks, Dea. So with all of this, what you're starting to see is that a lot of this learning is going to be scaffolded for students. We're going to start by really giving them that process, uncovering the main ideas, uncovering the structure, using articles that maybe have headings for students that need that. As they become more sophisticated, the texts, you'll see that maybe we have to go into some articles or some texts that have those main ideas embedded, or we really have to pull out those details. And you can clearly see that each of the articles I've presented so far are definitely, without a doubt, informational in nature. But I also know that a lot of you work with a lot of different reading programs where they identify texts in different ways. It might be called nonfiction narrative or nonfiction biography. You know, that's not as pure an example as an informational text. So I'm going to turn this over to Kathy Howell right now, and she's really gone through this book called Balloons Over Broadway with an eye for how we might analyze this and utilize it right within the classroom.
Thanks, Diane. Before I get started with this, one of the things I want to mention is that you're going to see me go through this informational text analysis with Balloons Over Broadway. This book is on the Fountas and Pinnell 5th grade book list. However, for the kinder and first grade teachers that are here today, what I want you to realize is that we have the same type of analysis sheet for you as well, but the analysis sheet doesn't go near as deep into the actual skills as you're going to see me go through with Balloons Over Broadway. It still goes through the foundational skills for you as a kinder or first grade teacher, looking at your picture books and thinking about what is it that I can highlight in this book that I can use and follow that methodology. Use this as my jumping off point for showing kids, listen, this is what an author does. This is author's craft. Now I want to teach you that same craft. So we have the same book analysis. In fact, that's where the book analysis started, was in the kinder and first grade classrooms and for those kinder and first grade teachers. So we also have those for you as well. But as we begin to look at Balloons Over Broadway, and I'm going to tell you that I did walk through this book for the very first time with a few questions of my own, thinking, okay, I know that it's an informational biography. It's actually listed on that book list as an informational biography. But then I noticed the title, and it says the story of the puppeteer of the Macy's Parade. So I'm thinking, okay, narrative, it says it's informational, but how do I link information to this book? And what does that look like as I begin to think about the skills that we teach for informational? So as we look at that, you'll notice that the first thing I did was read it. And I highlighted some of the skills that I thought this book really, the author's craft was strong in these particular skills. So you'll notice, if you'll pull that up for me, that this really is a great book to use for inferred main ideas or for golden bricks. There are many different golden bricks within the pages of this book. The detail generating questions, the author does a great job of using those detail generating questions to explain the details within the book. And then also there were several accounts of word reference within this piece. So those are the skills that I might highlight and use in this analysis form. So the title of the book is Balloons Over Broadway. The author is Melissa Sweet. This particular book gives information about Tony Sarg. He was the creator of those first balloons with the Macy's Day Parade. And then you'll notice I then took it down to its bare bones. I shrunk it to its summarizing framework. What was the writer's pre-writing plan? It started with the early life of Tony Sarg. It moved into his days as a marionette puppeteer. Then it went on to talk about his design for the Macy's window display, and then into the years that he spent as the master of the parade for the Macy's parade. Then we want to think about, this is my informational biography. What other connections can I make to other genres? Can I use some side-by-side pieces to go with this? Maybe the Festivals of the World, which is an Empowering Writers Cut and Paste piece in your guide. Or the book Peppy and the Parade, which is by Tracy Kyle. So these might be just, I mean, you can go any direction you wanted to. Maybe it's about turkeys for Thanksgiving, if you wanted to go that direction. But look at some comparative pieces that you could use at the same time that you're reading Balloons Over Broadway. Now, the next number 4 actually says, let's take a look and see if there's text conventions. In this particular book, there were some text conventions, maybe not all of your norm text conventions for an informational piece because it was missing that table of contents, but the author did use photos and captions and diagrams within the book. Now, I want you to notice the last part of number 4. It says, if there's no evidence of these elements, then how did you know it's informational? Well, for me, as I begin to look at this book, I try to decide which organizational tool can I pattern this book after. And what I realized is it really did fall into that informational pillar. That was the organizational tool, and I could reduce it to its bare bones using that summarizing framework. So let's now look at, on the next page of the informational text analysis, you'll notice that you could look at the introduction. You can look at those main ideas, those inferred main ideas. However, I want to focus on the supporting details. So if you look at number 5, does this author use the supporting details with the detail generating questions? What does it look like? Why is it important? Notice the first example. Tony knew of a company in Ohio that made blimps out of rubber, the perfect material for any weather. Notice, what does it look like? It's a blimp made out of rubber. Why is it important? Because it's the perfect material for any weather. You'll also notice that now I pulled up that page and I have text evidence. This is where I found this particular information using what does it look like? Why is it important? And I put a sticky note. So you can do this one of 2 ways. You can you can write this into your text analysis form, or you can just add sticky notes to the book if you would like. There are 2 other examples I want to show you here. One of the reasons that I pulled that out of this book. This time, he asked the company in Ohio to make balloons out of rubberized silk, as strong as rubber, but lighter than rubber alone. So again, what does it look like? Why is it important? And then the last one, also found on this same page, most important, Tony ordered the balloons to be filled not just with air, but with helium too. Since helium is lighter than air, it would make the balloons rise. What does it look like? Why is it important? And you can print it. You can add sticky notes to the book so that you can see, I'm looking for that skill. There's the text evidence that it is available within this book. So I want you to think about now, instructionally, from a teacher standpoint, what does this text analysis form allow us to do? First and foremost, actually, it allows us the opportunity to make that reading and writing connection. So if you think about that, earlier when Daya was going through those first few slides, she said, what if we teach our students to read proactively and interact with text in a meaningful way? That's the first thing from a teacher standpoint that this analysis sheet is going to drive you toward as the teacher. Instructionally, how do I find moments for my students to read proactively and look at text in meaningful ways? But what allows this to happen? Well, the reinforcement of our common language and foundational skills, that's what gives us that opportunity to instructionally add all of the elements that we're learning through those foundational skills. But I want you to think about this, that common language and those foundational skills, common language and assured experiences is what allows us to do the work that we do through this analysis piece and through our students interacting with text in meaningful ways. Also, it allows us to increase the depth of understanding across all text in multiple genres and subgenres. Think about the idea of going through and the deep knowledge that it took in the skills and as far as literacy to look at that Balloons Over Broadway and to pull out those particular skills that students would use in going deeper with this text. And then last, it allows for that instructional means to locate text evidence for response to writing, which in the state of Texas, I know that's the direction that we're going, is that responsive writing. Our students have to have the opportunities for all of this so that they can make the connections and they can understand how to look at text and respond. Always that reading-writing connection is first and foremost. So let's circle back to that literacy launch and the importance of the literacy launch.
And let's just remember that objectively, the literacy launch allows us to teach our students to look at text through the author's eyes. Remember, with the ability to deconstruct for the purposes of reconstructing. And that's really our key takeaway. So when we start with empowering writers and we all dive in that first month of school, every single grade level, K through 8, is going to spend time visiting those foundations of literacy, understanding what it allows us to do, so that ultimately the goal for our students to be productive readers and being able to respond to text in meaningful ways. And if we could just go ahead to the next slide, because I do want to point out an important part of the Venn diagram is as students learn those discrete skills that we really annotated. So remember, everything that Kath and Di talked about, many times it's on the awareness level. We're talking through it with students so they can see what authors do. We haven't showed them how to generate it yet. So what happens is when the literacy launch is complete, in the sense that we've introduced our students to the types of genres, we've introduced those graphic organizers, we know how to summarize text. So every single time we read it, we summarize either orally or in a written format. What that allows us to do is to go to the next level. And here's what the next level is. It could be for some of us to teach our kids how to generate informational writing. So upon completion of understanding that the genre and organization section, we're going to dive into those informational skills. But because I spent time in the literacy launch, it also allows for my students to have an awareness of narrative writing. So every time they come to narrative text, they understand it on an awareness level. They understand the diamond. They understand how to summarize it. So I could also be going from literacy right into the literacy launch directly into narrative writing. And again, the same thing applies. While I'm working on generating narrative skills for the purposes of my students being able to generate a narrative piece, they look at informational writing through the lens of awareness that they didn't have before I did this instruction. What this ultimately allows our students to do is to what we call read with author's eyes and build the foundational work that's necessary for response to text, constructive response, extended response, a literary analysis task. Always, when we look at tasks our students are asked to do in writing, we start with what do they need to know? And every single time we've asked this question, in the 25 years we've been with Empowering Writers and working at this, every single time we've come back to say, what do our students need to know? They need to know the elements that are in front of you. They need to understand how text is organized. They need to understand author's purpose. They need to understand the salient features that create narrative and informational writing. And for those of you who move into opinion, into argument, the movement from the understanding of informational to those other genres is quite seamless when they have that foundation in informational writing. So that's the one thing I have to say that we are most proud about at Empowering Writers is every single time we have a tweak in an assessment or our requirements change at grade levels, our instruction doesn't change. Ultimately, at some point, we have to look at what that assessment is and how do we show our students how to respond to it. But the skill work and the foundational work that we teach as them becoming emerging authors stays the same. So with that in mind, the last really part about this is, where do we go next? Where do you go from here? So with Empowering Writers, here's how we've set up our instruction. Everything begins with the literacy launch in terms of what we just looked at. So our genre and organization sections of our guides have now been revamped with what we call the literacy launch. Really no different, except for the fact that it now includes all the genres in that same introduction. From there, you move into whether or not you're going to be teaching those direct generative skills for narrative writing or informational writing. And all of that circles around to the skill work and the direct instruction that takes place for response to literature. So if you are in a state or in an area where you need to work on constructive response or response to literature, the information that you get from the literacy launch, from those discrete skills and informational narrative skills, allows you to respond to literature in the ways in which your students need to. One of the things that we enjoyed about preparing for this webinar is every single time we work together as a team and take our resources and put it through that lens, we're always saying, wow, this is great. All the work that they're doing, this book analysis, understanding text to this level, is building students to the level of understanding they need to do to find evidence and respond effectively to text. So in terms of what does that mean for you, certainly I'm going to open this up for any questions or answers. And we're going to introduce you to some of our upcoming workshops so you can see how we're setting up this instruction going forward.
Before we head there, Daya, if you're interested in a certificate of attendance, just snap a photo of the QR code. It'll take you right to a page where you will request that certificate of attendance. So take a moment, anyone who wants that, there's your QR code. And then we'll take a look at some of our upcoming workshops and the work that we have planned over the next several months.
So here we have virtual trainings that are coming up. So those are the dates when they're coming. Launching into literacy is going to be, we gave you today the very bare bones of what that looks like. So launching into literacy will be the beginning starting point, and then we're going to be going into informational skills on that June 3rd date. And then the launching into literacy is also followed by the narrative skills. And so you can see those dates that we have. The K1, our K1 audience will also have their actual book is already designed with the introduction into narrative and informational writing. And then we have some recorded sessions. So the literacy launch that we do as part of our virtual trainings is going to be a 2-hour session. For those of you who have been trained in Empowering Writers and you've been to the narrative and you've been to the expository and you say, you know what, I just need to get a better handle on it. And we really, really would love to invite our content teachers to join us in those sessions, because there's a lot of really good learning that takes place that's applied to those content areas, so that when we talk about maximizing instructional time, those conversations are moving into those content areas. And I always like to add is that in my own classroom, when I was teaching this approach, I didn't have time to apply the skills. So I did all the direct instruction in, quote, my reading time. And I applied the application of those skills in my content areas. So if I was working on informational writing, I'd move into science. And as I developed our science, whatever we were working on in science, whether it was life cycles or the seashore habitat, we built in time to apply the skills that we were learning during that, quote, writing time. We also will have a 2-hour response to text. So that is really teaching, how do we teach kids to respond to text, constructed response? How do they take the skills they know already? No mistake in the fact that we have an expectation that if you're going to be doing the response to text, that you have a good, thorough understanding of narrative skills and the expository skills, because what you will see is that those skills are absolutely necessary for our kids to respond well to a constructive response question.
Yep, and I want to piggyback on that, Day. I highly recommend that before you take a response to text, that you understand at least one set of skills. The literacy launch plus the informational skills would be highly recommended on our end before you head into response to text, even though I know that's sort of your assessment may be coming up and you're feeling a little, concerned about that. Highly recommend you taking the informational skills first.
And can we go back to our QR code?
I'm going to do that if I can figure out how to go backwards. There we go. There's our there's our QR code. Now that your phone's open.
So Sonia asked the question, will we be including short essay writing to prepare for STAR 2.0 when it's released? And Sonia, our guides really already are equipped with all the necessary skills that you need for that type of writing. They follow along with each one of the skills. At the end of each one of the isolated skill learning, that response to text lessons are included with each one of those under each tab. So yes, that's already included within your guide.
And Leanna, I want to.
Do you have something for grade 2 that you will share? Specifically, I don't know if the question was for the analysis form or in general, but if it's content in general, all of the content we talk about today, it will apply to grade 2 as well.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm missing the objective of that question, feel free to ask that one again.
The analysis form is for every grade level. We have a narrative and an informational analysis form, and you can use it at every grade level. Just use it with your grade level texts.
Second through
eighth. Correct.
Yep. K&1 has their own analysis form.
And I think Jen posted that we'll send that in in an email. Anyone who wants that K&1 form.
And then someone asked, would we walk through a narrative webinar like this as well? So the only real difference with the narrative would be when we look at that text for annotation. What does that look like in terms of the starting point? In terms of setting this whole session up, it all would be the same. So we just happen to move into informational skills instead of the narrative. So, I don't know that we have that schedule to do that.
Now, it would be very similar. Obviously, the literacy launch is going to give the very same skills are going to happen throughout that literacy launch. We would then your analysis form would just be picking out those narrative skills within books and texts that you're reading with kids.
So you know what we're going to do, because we're getting requests for the narrative, the narrative form, the analysis form. What we'll do is when we send someone, hopefully, I know my team is on right now. When we send the recording and you have access to the recording, we'll link the narrative form with it. Now, I will say this, because as teachers, we don't like to do that because we didn't show you how to use it. So no criticism that we sent you a form that we didn't demonstrate, but because you keep asking for it, we will send you the narrative form as well.
You're welcome.
So you can use that.
So I'm just going to
stop. And again, remember the whole idea of these forms are really not to add to your It is not to add to your to-do list. And what ends up happening is as we become more familiar with the skills, you're going to pick up books, or you're going to read something in your reading anthology, or you're going to be picking up something that's part of your curriculum now and say, oh my goodness, this is a really great example of this. And that's really what we want you to start to think about. We want you to move out of that whole idea of a writing block and recognize that those skills move right across the curriculum.
J. Rob asked for the annotation and analysis process. That is embedded right within the Hub Guide. You'll find that in our annotation and analysis lessons within the literacy launch. So you'll have a series of about 12 or 13 lessons in a literacy launch. The process, that sheet that I shared, is embedded right inside of their Hub. So you'll have that when you have your Hub Guide open.
And there's really two thoughts there. The initial analysis that we include in the book is really the foundational work necessary. We all have to be able to do that. The book analysis, or the text analysis that we've included and added, is a deeper dive when you have the understanding of the skills that go into those tasks.
Thanks, Tamara. Looking forward to having you. I'm going to stop my share now and we can just finish chatting out.
Any other questions?
Thank you all for coming. Happy to have you. Lots of good.
Glad the webinar was helpful. And you know, again, this is a process. This is a different way of really approaching our writing instruction, and we're here to support you through that.